Hi everyone, Derived Energy. I'm reading from Living in the End Times, Slavoj Zizek, who's described as the most dangerous philosopher in the West. Right, reading from the first few pages. The underlying premise of the present book is a simple one. The global capitalist system is approaching an apocalyptic zero point. Its four riders of the apocalypse are comprised by the ecological crisis, the consequences of the biogenetic revolution, imbalances within the system itself, problems with intellectual property, forthcoming struggles over raw materials, food and water, and the explosive growth of social divisions and exclusions. To take up only the last point, nowhere are the new forms of apartheid more palpable than in the wealthy Middle Eastern oil states, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Dubai. Hidden on the outskirts of these cities, often literally behind walls, are tens of thousands of invisible immigrant workers doing all the dirty work, from servicing to construction, separated from their families and refused all privileges. Such a situation clearly embodies an explosive potential which, while now exploited by religious fundamentalists, should have been channeled by the left in its struggle against exploitation and corruption. A country like Saudi Arabia is literally beyond corruption. There is no need for corruption because the ruling gang, the royal family, is already in possession of all the wealth, which it can distribute freely as it sees fit. In such countries, the only alternative to fundamentalist reaction would be a kind of social democratic welfare state. Should this situation persist, can we even imagine the change in the Western collective psyche when, not if, but precisely when, some rogue nation or group obtains a nuclear device or powerful biological or chemical weapon and declares its irrational readiness to risk all in using it? The most basic coordinates of our awareness will have to change insofar as today we live in a state of collective fetishistic disavowal. We know very well that this will happen at some point, but nevertheless cannot bring ourselves to really believe that it will. The US attempts to prevent such an occurrence through continuous preemptive activity is a battle that has been lost in advance. The very notion that it might succeed relies on a phantasmatic vision. Now, Zizek quotes this guy called Venter. Venter's dream is effectively to create the first trillion-dollar organism, patented bugs that could excrete biofuels, generate clean energy in the form of hydrogen, or even produce tailor-made foods. Imagine the end of fossil fuels, a cessation of ecologically devastating drilling operations, deflation of the political and economic power of neoconservative oil barons, and affordable low-emission transportation, heating, and electricity. The impact of this technology is profound, and it doesn't stop there. By discovering the details of biochemical and metabolic pathways, we can more closely mimic their elegance and efficiency to solve problems that plague industrial civilization. Maybe we'll engineer a primitive self-sustaining biorobot that feeds on CO2 and excretes O2. Perhaps we could remove mercury from our water supplies. The limitations are not known, but the possibilities are awe-inspiring. There are, as Venter admits, also more sinister possibilities. For example, it will be possible to synthesize viruses like Ebola or to build new pathogens, but the problems run deeper. Such such extreme genetic engineering will create substantially different organisms. We will find ourselves in a new terrain full of unknowns. The problem lies in our limited understanding of how DNA works. Even if we can put together a sequence of synthetic DNA, we cannot predict how it will actually perform, how its components will interact. DNA communicates with a cell by prompting it to make proteins, and we are far from fully understanding the relationship between a given DNA sequence, the proteins it generates, and the final properties of an organism. These dangers are heightened by the absence of any public control over what goes on in bioengineering, independent of any democratic oversight. Profiteering industrialists are tinkering with the building blocks of life. Research points towards the uncanny fact that the secret US defense agencies are involved in wide-ranging and long-term projects to develop the means to control human emotions and attitudes remotely by attacking brains with precise electromagnetic waves. Since it is already possible to identify the brain waves that materially support particular emotional attitudes, fear, hatred, outrage, courage, the idea is to bombard the brain with similar artificially generated waves in order to produce or thwart the targeted emotion. A similar procedure has already been tested in the context of treating veterans for post-traumatic effects by identifying the material support of traumatic memory traces in the brain and then exposing the brain to specific waves. These traces can be erased, with limited short-term memory loss as an undesired side effect. While the scope of these practices is unknown, it seems clear that there are sufficient grounds for assuming that the agencies involved are engaged in a major effort to exploit the possibility of collapsing the difference between inside and outside, directly linking the wiring of the brain to external technologically manipulable processes. The ideal that regulates this research is the possibility of eventual full control of past and future at the psychic level. The strategy is always the same. An invention is first presented as a brilliant new remedy for some debilitating illness, so that no one can oppose it, and is then extended to other fields. There is already extensive research into genetic and biochemical interventions which might selectively erase a subject's traumatic past, and thereby enable, say, a victim of torture or rape to regain normalcy. The problem arises, of course, when such a procedure is expanded to include a more total control of traces of the past. Rich prospective parents can already afford to have their unborn child's brain scanned for traces of possible future mental weaknesses, low IQ, criminal tendencies, and again, what would be the consequences of the possible universalization of this procedure? One has to avoid here a double trap: the utopian dream of a benevolent cleansing of the brain, of protecting it from illnesses, and removing the traces of post-trauma, but also the false doomsday perspective which treats all such interventions into the brain as signaling the end of humanity. With all their warnings about how we are on the brink of a post-human era, transhumanists effectively remain too humanist. That is to say, when they describe the possibility of intervening in our biogenetic base and changing our very nature, they somehow presuppose that the autonomous subject freely deciding on his or her acts will still be present, deciding on how to change its nature. They thus take the split between the subject of the enunciated and the subject of enunciation to its extreme. On the other hand, as the object of my interventions, I am a biological mechanism whose properties, including mental ones, can be manipulated. On the other hand, I act as if I am somehow exempt from this manipulation, an autonomous individual who, acting at a distance, can make the right choices. But what about the prospect of the loop being closed, so that my very power of decision-making is already meddled with by biogenetic manipulation, and the autonomous individual is no longer there? That is why there always seems to be something shallow, boring even, about all transhumanist meditations. They basically ignore the problem, and like their critics, avoid the core of the question with which they appear to be dealing. How will biogenetic and other interventions affect the very definition of humanity? Both transhumanists and their critics unproblematically cling to the standard notion of a free autonomous individual. The difference is that transhumanists simply assume that it will survive the passage into the post-human era, while their critics see post-humanity as a threat to be resisted. With the idea of humans as a species, the universality of humankind falls back into the particularity of an animal species. Phenomena like global warming make us aware that, with all the universality of our theoretical and practical activity, we are, at a certain basic level, just another living species on planet Earth. Our survival depends on certain natural parameters which we automatically take for granted. The lesson of global warming is that the freedom of humankind was possible only against the background of stable natural parameters of life on Earth: temperature, the composition of the air, sufficient water and energy supplies, and so on. Humans can do what they like, only insofar as they remain marginal enough so as not to seriously perturb natural preconditions. The limitations of our freedom that become palpable with global warming is the paradoxical outcome of the very exponential growth of our freedom and power, that is, of our growing ability to transform nature around us, up to and including destabilizing the very framework for life. The December 2009 Copenhagen talks between the top representatives of 20 great powers about how to fight global warming failed miserably. The result was a vague compromise without any fixed deadlines or obligations, more a statement of intentions than a treaty. The lesson is bitter and clear. The state's political elites serve capital. They are unable and/or unwilling to control and regulate capital even when the very survival of the human race is ultimately at stake.